Hi everyone, I'm Alister Benn and you're watching Expressive Photography. In this week's video, I want to explore the challenges of photographing in forests. I've been running a workshop on the Canary Islands and one of the things that's really evident is as soon as you move into a forest, things get tough, things get complicated. So in this video, I want to look at the environment, the challenges of the environment, how we can find better photographs, more meaningful photographs in that environment, when are the better times to be in there, the whole process of being in forests. And then next week, we're going to look at some of those photographs and we're going to process them from start to finish in a slightly longer video where we dive into the attributes of forest photography and how to bring out the best in your photographs. It's probably only about 6 years ago that I made the transition from being a photographer who really didn't like photographing in forests to someone who absolutely loves photographing in forests. And what really happened was a paradigm shift, a change in my attitude from someone who thought he didn't like photographing in forests to someone who believed that he could photograph in forests. And I know that may sound a little bit simplistic and maybe a little bit too understated, but one of the classic expressions is you can't see the forest for the trees. And sometimes I don't think we can see the compositions because we're looking for compositions. So in this video, I want to just talk about the environment that we were in, where we were, the circumstances of our opportunity there. So like I said, I was on the Canary Islands running a small workshop and we had two centres. We had an area in the south when we were photographing more seascapes and up into the volcano and the mountainous areas, some night photography. And then purposefully, we had had a second 5 nights of accommodation in the northern parts of the island where there's some really amazing forest that I'd explored on previous visits to the island. Now, one of the things about this forest is that it's a cloud forest. It exists because of slightly higher rainfall and more moisture, more cloud builds up there. And it's a laurel forest. And what that means is it's very dense, it's very dark, it's a very overgrown and tangled area. And it has this very windy road meandering through it with lots of hairpin bends and steep ascents and descents. And quite often the hillside is very steep and the road just weaves across it. So it's a very chaotic and a very cluttered landscape. It is also very variable because some days there is no fog, there is no cloud, and other days it's incredibly thick and impenetrable, even with quite a lot of rain. You're also limited with where you can stop the car. It's a narrow road, there's a lot of traffic uses this road, and it's not always easy to pull in. But there are a few little spots that we found where we could pull off at the side of the road, nice and safe, and we could start to explore the area. Now, what that means is that you don't know what you're going to get until you open the car door, get out and start looking around. So the element of planning is virtually none. You know, you don't even know what type of forest it's going to be. Is it going to be bigger trees? Is it going to be smaller, narrower, spindly trees? Is it going to be steep or is it going to be more level? That extent of unpredictability lends itself to having a very open and positive attitude. If all we were doing all the time was looking for a specific type of thing, just about every time we stopped the van would have been a disappointment because, oh, this isn't what we're looking for. This isn't what we're looking for. And if we constantly go into an environment thinking what we know or thinking that we know what we want, we're always going to struggle. So what I have here, I think in my Lightroom catalog, I took 132 photographs in my few days in this cloud forest. And we were very fortunate on one of those days to have quite a lot of cloud. And what that does is it adds the element of atmosphere. Anyone who's been watching expressive photography for any length of time knows that there are 5 attributes to the landscape: luminosity, contrast, color, geometry, and atmosphere. What are the attributes that are most relevant in forests? Well, of course, atmosphere if we have cloud, but if we don't, we have to start manipulating atmosphere by introducing maybe shallow depth of field. And that way we can start diffusing backgrounds, and that in its own right is an atmospheric element. Geometry is clearly a very, very important thing to look at. And what we'll do is I'm going to skim through some of the photographs that I've taken, find the ones that leap out at me, and sort of work out, well, why are they leaping out at me? Because the reason they leap out of the screen is exactly the same reason as they leapt out of me. They leapt out at me from the landscape through the viewfinder. What you will find with forest photography is that if you're walking around looking for compositions, you will not find them. This is the biggest failing and hurdle that most photographers are going to experience in the landscape. If you go in looking for something, the best opportunity you're going to have is to find what you're looking for, which is almost never going to happen, especially in an unpredictable landscape. But secondly, if you don't find what you're looking for, you're going to get frustrated and disappointed. The attitude that you then have is one of negativity and despair. And I don't think a lot of positive outcomes are going to come from that type of attitude. I tend to go into the landscape and see things that I think are interesting. So if I just start to... So here's a reasonable example here. This curvy branch stood out as something different. It was quite a cool twist. And I think I've got a few compositions, both horizontal and vertical. These are just the embedded previews. So if I was shooting a Velvia simulation or any other Provia film simulation, that is what you're going to get. Of course, as soon as we go into the develop module, the film simulation disappears. And as soon as I go into the crop aspect ratio, you can see that I have all the pixels available to me. One of the things I strongly advocate when you are photographing in any environment is to give yourself a preview on the back of the screen that's going to engage you and make you feel good about what you're looking at. Last week in the video, I talked about better than life, that concept that when you look through the viewfinder, you're seeing something that's actually better than what your eyes are experiencing. And that can be achieved by using an aspect ratio or a focal length that suddenly makes big cropped decisions or big processed decisions about what you are seeing in the landscape. As you can see from the various film clips that we're using to illustrate this video, there's an awful lot of content out there. Our vision is something like about 118 degrees with some peripheral blurring, but most of what we see is in that kind of focal, that kind of field of view, but we're seeing everything at roughly 50 millimeters in terms of the magnification in a 35 millimeter equivalent. So the landscape that we see with our eyes is very different from the landscape we see through our camera. And the reason we're photographers is we like the way the landscape looks through a camera. So one of the big shifts that I've experienced moving to the FujiFilm GFX100s from my Nikon D850 is the fact that it's a mirrorless system. So when I hold the camera up to my eyes with an electronic viewfinder, I'm seeing live the impact of the aspect ratio and the film simulation on the scene. Whereas with my old D850, looking through the camera, it's a DSLR, you're looking through the lens, you're seeing the landscape through the lens. So you don't see those same changes that you're making to either the processing or the aspect ratio. So of course, being somewhat new still to the FujiFilm GFX100s, I'm in love with this pano aspect ratio. It's something I've wanted to do for decades, is shoot in panos. So going into the landscape and seeing things through a panoramic aspect ratio has been really engaging for me. Now, of course, having the full frame to play with, we will definitely look at next week, because I will be totally changing some of these aspect ratios to articulate different things about the scene. As I said to you at the beginning there, and here's a good example, this is actually the road. So the road was winding through the forest, and the fog was obviously easier to see as we moved into the forest. As it was above the road. And what I found most in my relationship with the forest was to understand that we cannot in any shape or form manipulate the feel of a forest. Trees grow in certain ways. In a busy environment, trees are always heading up towards the light, and they're being influenced by slopes, and they're being influenced by geology and the geography of the landscape. But the light is where they're going to be aiming for. Trees have this wonderful habit of looming over roads. They grow to cover a road, which is a beautiful way of creating these kind of tunnels. And of course, if we go in and flip some of these images horizontally, we can move whereabouts that road is going to be. And these are definitely some of the things we're going to look at in next week's video when we start looking at the processing. But for now, I want to kind of think, well, why did I notice this? What was the purpose of pointing my camera at this scene? Because if I go to the full frame, you can see that it's a pretty ordinary looking scene, you know, with the van sat there at the side of the road, and you can see the road itself. But that crop allowed me to see something that was more than the mundane reality of what was presenting itself to me. If we look at the attributes of luminosity, contrast, color, geometry, and atmosphere, all of them exist in these scenes. So luminosity, we have some light is filtering through. I think it's always a good idea to try and eliminate sky in forest photography because it creates these massive exposure differences. So contrast between the brightest stuff. If you're photographing skies through forest, it is inevitable you're going to have clipped highlights usually, and that in its own right is going to create highly dynamic problems. Our eyes are going to get drawn to these very, very bright highlights, and this is going to be part of the processing, is how to contain any of those bright distractions, because that's what they are, is distractions. So we want the luminosity of the scene to be the key thing. So you can see here, if I just increase, it's worth mentioning here that I've photographed all of these photographs handheld. I didn't use any tripod at all. So I am using 2500 ISO. I'm hand holding at 1/200th of a second at f5.6. So I'm really trying to get as much sharpness out of these handheld photographs as I possibly can. This is with my 45 to 100mm f4. It's an IS lens, so I've got image stabilization on it. So I can handhold these and get really sharp photographs down to quite low shutter speeds, but I was keeping the shutter speed a little bit higher just to make sure. So from a technical point of view, if you're rooted down by a tripod, that is going to create a significant barrier. Every time you see something that you think, oh, that looks kind of interesting, that spontaneity of just pointing your camera at it, composing, zooming in and out, and then just taking a couple of quick frames is a really, really nice way to shoot in a forest. You can be very spontaneous, very loose, very free. As soon as you have got to level your tripod, get it sorted out so it's not stuck in the middle of the road, level it to make sure it's okay, get the camera set up, level everything again. All of these steps are little barriers to that spontaneous engagement with the landscape. I just like to be able to see, compose, shoot. And unless, of course, it's very, very dark in there, in which, of course, you have to start using the tripod to get steady, sharp images. So the luminosity is created here by the way the light was interacting with the fog. That was a key element here, and I just love these kind of foggy atmospheric tunnels. So the luminosity is one thing. The contrast between the geometric forms of the trees and the atmosphere and the open spaces is very important. Plus we have color shifts between more verdant, bright, yellowy greens versus darker, more matte, more subdued green greens. We're doing a big colour theme on the members forum just now, and there's also a great debate about the luminosity of colours. Some colours are brighter than others, and the way these trees are interacting with the light shows us that we have dark greens when they're in shadow, and we have light yellowy greens when it's in light. And we can use that contrast between darks and lights and darker colours and lighter colours to add contrast, to add interest in our photography. You will also notice that sometimes you get a bit of a bluish tinge through the fog. That is another way that we can add more colour contrast, more luminosity contrast. And of course the geometry. Like I said, trees have this tendency to loom over roads. They also fall down slopes. As they get heavier, they start to bend over. That wonderful kind of looming geometry is another wonderful attribute. So as you can see in this frame here, we have luminosity, we have contrast, we have color, we have geometry, and we have atmosphere. So we have 5 triggers all working together. And then the aspect ratio that I've chosen creates a very strong angle from this corner to this corner, which forces us to just engage with the entire frame from left to right or back again from right to left. Aspect ratios are one of the most important ways to make a landscape feel less normal. 3:2 is the typical aspect ratio of most 35mm based camera systems. I know that 4/3 or 4:3 is also a common system. 4:5 for medium format photography. 1:1, like in my Hasselblad 6:6 camera, is a 1:1 aspect ratio. Aspect ratios are an excellent way to introduce variability, change, and feel into our landscapes. Some of the photographs I took were kind of just curious little interests. I liked the way the road was interacting with the forest here. I've allowed the rest of it to just be in shadow. All of these are basically JPEG previews. There's no processing being done to these. These are straight out the camera. But I kind of like this, you know, just a straight 4:5 vertical. There's something, yeah, I like it. Introducing geometry, introducing luminosity, introducing textural and tonal differences. If we get back to more straightforward forest photography, this is another example of shooting over the road, using that tunnel. And you can see we do have some clipped highlights in there, which is exactly what I was explaining earlier, that as soon as the sky is in the frame, and we're going to have to deal with that quite aggressively in post-processing, but we will definitely come to that later on. But you can see again how easy it is to use an aspect ratio to eliminate distracting content, to eliminate something that isn't part of the scene, that isn't part of the graphical representation that we want to show. And as soon as we get rid of that road and just allow the geometry of the trees and the resultant luminosity and contrast and color and atmosphere to just play their roles, we can end up making photographs again that I just think are better than life, you know, to coin last week's expression. I have to confess that the entire group had an absolute whale of a time working through this landscape. Everywhere we turned, there was just something new to look at, something new to engage with, from beautiful ferns to all of the different tree species, all of the different slopes and angles. And having that spirit of openness, it was like myself and the 3 clients, we were just running around like kids in a candy store. We stayed way longer than we had intended to stay because we were interested, we were fascinated, we were engaged, we were excited, we were energized. All of this was resulting in positive experiences. And that is the key to forest photography. It is also the key to every other type of photography, but in a complex environment, it's less obvious. When you go somewhere simple and more, there's the sea stack, there's the boulder in the foreground, there's the pointy mountain, there's the river running towards it. When you're in landscapes where the geometry of the composition is so much more obvious, I think it's a lot easier to make obvious photographs. When you're in a complex environment, you have to surrender to that complex environment and appreciate that it is going to be what it is, and it's up to us to ease ourselves into that landscape in as seamless way as possible. We just become part of the forest. You immerse yourself in the forest. You listen to the forest and its rhythms, its directionality. Everything is striving towards the light. Next week, when we come to look at the processing of some of these photographs, we are going to be using the attributes that exist in them and understanding how to use those to best effect to articulate something of the experience and of our intent, of our relationship with the landscape. Not everyone is going to like your photographs, and I think that's worth mentioning just now, but we'll obviously be touching on that again next week. Hopefully this little video has given you some insights into my relationship with forests and how my relationship with photographing forests has changed over the last 5 or 6 years. I used to hate it. It was confusing and I just didn't understand the landscape at all. But I've changed my attitude. I have become a more open and accepting person. I don't go into these environments looking for compositions because you cannot. I'm not going to go and find something I took 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm not going to go and find something that somebody else took that I found on Google. I want to go in there and find myself in the landscape. Like I said, I hope you've enjoyed this. Please tune in next week when I'm going to be doing some processing of some of these photographs and hopefully pull in the whole topic into a nice little round package. If you want to make sure of a notification, please hit the subscribe button, do the old bell notification, and of course, please check out our learning material, Expressive Photography, Luminosity and Contrast, The Color of Meaning, Creativity Superpowers. All of these books discuss ways of interacting with the landscape that are far more organic and are going to give you a much better path to finding your true photographic self and the way you want to articulate yourself through your art. Cheers for now, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye.